Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the glory of God and his kingdom. Every once in a while, you come across an individual who inspires in several different respects, inspires with his intellect, inspires with his clarity, and inspires not least with his courage. One such individual, I'm very pleased to say, is giving us a full hour of his time today to talk about his perspectives on the country we love, and that, importantly, he loves very much. In fact, it's the subject of one of his important books entitled We Have Overcome, an immigrant's letter to the American people. His name is Dr. Jason Hill. He is a professor at DePauw University and the author, in addition to We Have Overcome, of a number of other books, including most recently, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. He's an incredibly thoughtful individual, but what I feel very strongly that is most admirable, in a way, about him is the passion that he brings to his love of our country as what I call a foreign-born American patriot. It's a perspective that we relish showcasing on this program, and few exhibit the best of it more than Dr. Jason Hill. Jason, my friend, it's great to have you back. Thank you for giving us a full hour of your time. It's great to have a chance to really visit with you at length.
It's my pleasure. It's good to be back. Feels like coming home.
Well, I hope so. And we're delighted when you do. So give us, if you would, at kind of a 30,000-foot level, how you, as a foreign-born American patriot, perceive the state of our country at the moment, good and bad.
Good and bad. Well, I think right now the country is very, very exhausted, morally, spiritually, at the so-called divisiveness and the bifurcation that is taking place in our country among a lot of issues, whether it's abortion, whether it's trans ideology, whether it's wokeism, which I want to talk about because I think that's a sort of pagan religion that is replacing Christianity, Judeo-Christianity in our culture. But I think the culture is very, very, what I sense is from giving talks across the country on my work, is the country and Americans are just exhausted. And one of the reasons that we're all exhausted is that we can't simply seem to get our terms straight, and we can't simply seem to have a proper intellectual conversation about these topics without our emotions mediating the topics in a sort of vitriolic way. And, you know, I was saying to a friend of mine who voted for Donald Trump is that I said to this person at a Thanksgiving gathering, you know, you can dislike Donald Trump all you want, but you cannot hate the people who voted for Donald Trump. We're talking about half the country. And if you're going to hate half of Americans, that's going to make you almost like a misanthropic person. So that's part of where I see the country just really, really exhausted.
Let me ask you about that particular point. It would be one thing if people in this country were simply hating, as you put it, the half the country that supported Donald Trump in the 2020 election. We have the government of the United States describing them as enemies of the state. This goes beyond hating. This suggests that they are, well, threats to our nation, to our national security, most especially. What do you make of that, Jason Hill?
Well, this is a direct attempt to truly polarize the country in not an organic manner. When I say organic, not in a manner in which people have differing opinions and the polarization is occurring because people just organically find themselves, falling on the conservative or falling on the liberal side. This is a concerted, systematic effort on the part of the far left to create bifurcations, to create chasms in our country, and to foster hatred and divisions in the country. And the reason they want to do this, I am convinced, is because this is part of a movement to create artificial divisions in order to change the political DNA of our country, to bring in a far left socialist regime in our country. If you can bring in artificial divisions and call the people, half the country who voted for the other side that's not in power, enemies of the state, then you really are creating not just a class war, but you are creating uh, a war among compatriots who otherwise would normally disagree among themselves, but would not necessarily see their compatriots as their enemies. They may see them as their political. I mean, I have people who say, I see you as an honorable adversary. I don't agree with your conservatism, but I see you as an honorable adversary. But they don't see me as their enemy. This is a systematic and systemic attempt on the part of we can't even call them the left anymore, because the left has become so far left that I used to use the term alt left anymore. Let's just say this is a part of the left to demonize and stigmatize dissenting opinions, and to create in the minds of one half of Americans that their compatriots who don't agree with them are enemies of the state, in order to usher in, to change the political DNA of this country, to usher in a warlike mentality, to create the revolution that they want to see created.
Bang. That's the point I wanted to get to. There does seem to be at work here, whether you call it the left or the alt left or progressives or the radical left or socialists, the term you used, or communists or Marxists for that matter, an agenda of destruction of the country using these fault lines, whether it's race, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, whether it's class, whether it's education, whether it's some other sort of vehicle for dividing us, yes, turning us against one another, yes, and ultimately helping to foster this revolution that, as you say, they seem to aspire to. The fundamental transformation of America is what Barack Obama, of course, called it.
Yes,
Have I got your assessment of that correct?
absolutely. Yes, yes.
Okay. And to the extent that you are seeing this very vividly, of course, in academia, where you have, been teaching, well, I'd say behind enemy lines, but I'm sure you can't call it that. But you're in an environment in which I'm sure you are surrounded and buffeted by this endlessly, are you not?
I am. I've been a professor for 25 years now in the academy, 23 at DePaul. And the universities are the transmission belt, the conveyor of this kind of fostering of an attitude that is sheer indoctrination, that is the promulgation of left wing, postmodern Marxist ideas, where what we find is nothing more than not just hatred of capitalism, not just hatred of individualism, but what I would call rampant Americophobia, where if you find in yourself, such as I do, the urge to express love for this great, exceptional country, the most moral country, the most exceptional, unprecedented phenomenon in the history of human civilization, you are branded really as an enemy of the state, as an enemy of the people. They're rebranding the meaning of America, right? And we have overcome. I devoted a long, long chapter on the moral meaning of America. That is to give the American people the moral meaning of their country. And what you find in the academy is that they're rebranding the meaning of America to have it come to mean something on the order of an intrinsically bigoted, irredeemably, irrevocably racist and oppressive country that was formulated consciously to enslave people and to keep them enslaved, and that it was built fundamentally on the backs of Black people and people of color in general, and that this is the definitive meaning of America, not one of liberty, not one of constantly trying to remedy itself and to become a better place, which is part of the moral meaning of America, I argue, but one that is devoted to systemically keeping people locked into positions of oppression. The consequence of this is that we have a generation, the Z generation, that is calling for the overthrow of this country. When I ask my students every semester, what are your hopes for America? I would say that about 70% of them tell me that they want to go into corporations and rebrand those corporations into the image of something quite radically different. And I say, what is this? And they say, well, we want to make them into socialist regimes. We want to make this country into a socialist country. Because capitalism is systemically, this is something else that's being taught in university, this term racist capitalism, that capitalism is systemically racist. And when I tell them the history of capitalism, that capitalism was responsible really for abolishing or ameliorating racism, that racism and capitalism are philosophical antipodes. It's the antithesis of racism. They have a sort of a paucity in their reading of capitalism. What they're motivated by is power and what I call the age of nihilism, which is what we're ensconced in, the age of nihilism, the destruction of values and the destruction of the good because it is the good, and the destruction of America because it is a good country.
And this is, of course, very much the object of foreign enemies as well, notably the Chinese Communist Party, which has been feeding into all of this. Well, I would argue that the very practice of dividing us along racial lines is a sort of version of the cultural Marxism, which in China was, focused on class, but has basically been very easily adapted to playing this race card. And of course, you've written this book, What Do White Americans Owe Black People, which sort of comes to grips directly with this whole idea that not only are we systemically racist and hateful and oppressive towards Black people, whites of America, but that is giving rise to a legitimate basis for demanding reparations from the whites to the Blacks. Something we'll talk about in another context in a moment. But give us your sort of essential take of what that entails, and is that in fact, as you see it, something that is owed by current generations of white people who had nothing to do with slavery?
Most certainly not. I mean, I think that reparations have been paid. We've had three great foundings in this country. The first was a great founding in 1776, and with the Declaration of Independence. The second founding, I would argue, was Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in the Civil War, where thousands and thousands of white and Black soldiers fought to liberate the slaves. And the third great founding was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which not only, I argue, brought Blacks full standing before the law, but in violating property rights of white people, was what I call a moral eugenics program, in that it sought to retrain the sensibilities of white people, racist white people, and to make them into non-racist, along with the 1965 Voting Rights Acts, the 1972 Unemployment Act, and the subsequent affirmative programs. The debt has been paid, or the right has been wronged, short of becoming, Frank, a bloated totalitarian state. There is nothing more, and I lay this out in the book, there's nothing more that whites can do for Blacks. We have to say that we value freedom and liberty more than we value equality of outcomes. And the state has done and has gone as far as it can go in remedying the great injustices. And one can't argue that America was born with a horrible birth defect called slavery. but it has done everything possible that a free and just society can do to remedy those wrongs against blacks. Today, I would go as far as to say that if you are a black man, if you're a black person, you're part of what I call the sacred cows in this country. There is no corporation, there is no academic institution that will not bend over backward to seek you out. And we have these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives now that make it almost illegal for these corporations, but even not to do so. But even before that, the country was moving towards such a progressive trend that there are no movements in this country that are out to systemically and systematically destroy the lives of Black people in this country. Quite the opposite.
This is such a key point, Jason, and it's against the official narrative of the Biden administration, and I think the Democratic Party more generally, that holds to the contrary. There are things inherent to the society that do oppress and have to be remedied through, again, this fundamental transformation, diversity, equity, inclusion being sort of code words for, well, a Marxist reboot of America. And I think what you've said is so both insightful and, again, courageous and needed, that if anything, what we're being told is the remedy is something that will deny not just white people, but everybody rights and freedoms and liberties that are to the great benefit of all. When we talk about these sorts of issues, Jason, of course, we're instructed that the remedy for the defects of America lie in inculcating everybody, but most especially oppressive whites, with critical race theory, indoctrination. There's some cavilling about whether this is being taught anywhere other than in a few law schools, but I think it's pretty clear this is part of the curricula, not just at the university level, where, of course, you teach at DePaul University, but right on down to elementary schools, in some cases at least. Tell us a little bit about what's in CRT, as it's known, and how it fits into what we've just been talking about, particularly this idea that we need to get away from equality of opportunity to equalities of outcome.
Well, CRT in its third iteration, I mean, it started out with Derek Bell in the 1970s that was based on systemically looking at the systemic racism that existed in legal theory and sort of questioned the legitimacy of Enlightenment principles and neutrality before the law. And it went through a second iteration in the 90s. In its third iteration, which is the most nefarious form, it basically says that if you're a white person, that you bear unilateral white privilege, and that you're the conferrer of oppression onto white people, onto Black people. So we have in our K through 12 all sorts of pernicious and nefarious exercises going on, where you've got white children walking 4 steps ahead of Black kids, and Black kids walking 5 steps behind, and the white kids are told, this is what you're doing. By the color of your skin, you have an automatic privilege. Before I talk about the equity movement, let me just say that I think what critical race theory does is that it's a form of systemic racism against white people. And I'm writing a book called I probably shouldn't say it, but it's on something on the order, It's Okay to Be White, a Black man's letter to white America, because I think that we have a really radical anti-white movement that is going on in America through the name of critical race theory. You see it in Coca-Cola, a new mandate which says be less white, which means be less punctual, be less excellent, be less certain. These are all universal traits which are taken to be white traits. And you have the white abolitionist movements by Afro-pessimists and various progressive whites and blacks who have taken up the idea that the only way that blacks can progress is to abolish something called whiteness, which really means the abolition of the white race. And so the equity movement is a really pernicious movement because it says something on the order of that unless it, well, it attributes all forms of economic disparities between and among the races to racism and to residual effects of slavery, when it's really predicated on a false premise, right? Because we're not all equal. We're not all equally intelligent. We're not all equally moral. We're not all equally frugal. If you put 100 people in the room and you give them $1,000, check back with them in a year. Some people are going to put that $100 under the mattress. Some people are going to invest it. Some people are going to invest it in a Cadillac. Some people are going to do very different things with it because we are also not all equally imbued with equal virtues. And how do you redistribute virtues? How do you redistribute values? The outcomes often depend on the values that we have and the moral sensibilities that we carry and the talents that we have. And so, because I'm not the equal of my athletic, my Jamaican compatriot. Well, he's not. I mean, I'm an American, but Usain Bolt, right? I'm not the athletic equal of Serena or Venus Williams. I mean, they would squash me to death on the tennis court. So, because we have to defeat this egalitarian idea. We're equal in the eyes of God, in that we have equal moral worth, but we can't predict equal outcomes. That is socialism. And that is a recipe for a centralized government that wants to assure equal outcomes regardless of talents, regardless of, more importantly, values and virtues, which cannot be redistributed.
And again, you've studied these matters closely. You've written brilliantly about them in both book form and in various essays. There is a bit of history here, is there not, with respect to socialism and the application of these various doctrines? We aren't simply dealing with the abstraction any longer. We're dealing with a lot of hard, I think it's fair to say, very hard in some cases, experience. Talk a little bit about that, and how is it that your counterparts in academia, who have been engines of promoting this CRT business and more broadly the DEI program, I think it would be better DIE myself, but DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, don't they get the history here and the very, very harmful impact this kind of program has had on everybody, but most especially, I would argue, the poor?
They're ensconced in the history. They know the history. They want to promulgate and propagate the history on the American people. I cannot emphasize how much the professoriate hate America. Oh, yes, they do know the history. I mean,
The history or a history? I mean, I'm not sure that it's a factually based history, is it? Because you can't, I mean, honestly, you can't claim that Marxism has worked out anywhere in
That's
terms
right.
of creating real equitable, uh, outcomes for people,
Well, they
let
certainly
alone
do.
equal opportunities.
They certainly know the kind of mayhem, destruction, and chaos that it breeds, that it wreaks in a society, and they know the sort of manipulation and sort of political machinations that they can employ in order to. They still are like children, uh, fantasize about, on their watch it will be different, right? In this country it will be different. So the historical record which we have to show that it has been abysmally a bit an abysmal failure in so many examples. But in their stupid minds, in their fantastical world, it'll be different.
It's
And
just
so,
there's nothing wrong with the theory or the system per se. It's just that it hasn't been properly executed, and they will. I'm reminded that the actual history suggests that it's axiomatic that the first people put up against the wall and shot, talk about executed, will be the people who have been promoting these kinds of nostrums when the real, hardcore Marxist revolutionaries take over. No,
The academics, that's right.
yeah, the
That's right.
academics and other intellectuals and so on. So to come back to your point a moment ago, that it's very difficult to overstate the virulence of the anti-Americanism of the professoriate. You obviously are a notable exception to that rule, and there are others. One of our other contributors is Dr. Michael Rechtenwald,
Mm-hmm.
who I'm sure you know lost his job, as a matter of fact, at New York University when he sort of departed from the Marxist fold. Um, Talk a little bit about how it is that this has come to pass. This is not an overnight or problem that is unique to a place like DePaul or New York University, for that matter. But what's the animating force behind it, as you've seen it?
Well, I think this really goes back. This is part of the educational system in America, which has never, ever really radically been pro America. I mean, Jordan Peterson was talking about this recently when he said, you go back to the system of the 1900s and the the professoriate and the educators who were educated under not just the Frankfurt system and the critical theorists, but the Hegelian Marxists, and sort of imported that into the system. And you go back to the 1900 school system where all the chairs were lined up equally, like a factory. All the students were taught to respond to stimuli. You had a bell that went off, and where children just like ran out of the classroom. Critical thinking, much to the chagrin of people who are going to hear this, was really never the goal of the educational system in America. It was to build and create a set of really automatons. That's why I'm against government schools. And we're talking about the public school system now. The private schools are different. But the government school system was never really about creating an enlightened citizenry or, people who were qualified to question authority. This is the province of the private schools and the parochial schools. As someone who was raised in a Jesuit school in Jamaica, you would think that I was raised by dogma and by diktat. But no, we were also raised to think critically and to question that which the Jesuits were teaching us. So I think this also, but more importantly, Frank, to answer your question much, much more directly, I think what happened was in the 1960s with the importation of postmodernism and post-structuralism and the emergence of what I call advocacy or revolutionary studies or victim studies programs. And this is part of the darker side. People think that the civil rights movement was all hunky-dory. There was a good side to the civil rights movement, and there was a dark side to the civil rights movement. The dark side came with the creation of these victim studies like Black studies and queer studies, women's studies, post-colonial studies, Chicano studies. These were advocacy studies. These were not scholarships. These were granting sovereignty to, and we saw the birth of radical identity politics in America. And their goal was really, and you started to see this, to attack reason, to attack logic, to attack, in quote, so-called the white man's way of colonizing the minds of marginalized people. If you look at and I've studied the curricula of these women's studies, these queer studies, these what they call LGBTQ plus studies programs, and their goal really was to question reason and logic, and the whole Western canon as nothing but the construct of white European male racists whose intent was to keep out of the pantheon of the human community and the domain of the ethical marginalized people. So reason and logic, which are tools that we use to adjudicate truth claims, were thrown out the window and were replaced by feelings, by subjectivity. The idea of an objective reality got thrown out the door. And Frank, we see this today with the trans movement. A man can just decide that he wants to be a woman, and he becomes a woman. So the primacy of feelings and the primacy of consciousness over existence, that is, I just have to feel something and my consciousness decides what I want, and therefore it exists. This started in the 1960s with throwing out of reason or undermining reason and logic as objective tools for dispensing or adjudicating or arbitrating among competing truth claims, um, dispensing with the Western canon. Today, it's called decolonization of the syllabi or of the canon. I get this all the time at my school, which means ridding the canon, ridding your syllabi of dead white European males. This has led to pure nihilism because they're replaced not with analogs that are, competitively speaking, they're equals. They're replaced with inferior figures in the name of diversity. And so what we have today is a situation in which scholarship that has stood the test of time, reason and logic, which are forms of adjudicating among truth claims, are criminalized. And you have, it's like beggars making invidious comparisons among their sores. Who can scream the loudest? Whose identity politics can gain greater traction among other forms of identity politics? And this is where we are today, in a nihilistic situation where, and I must say, wokeism, which is a pagan religion, has replaced Judeo-Christianity in our K through 12 and certain in our colleges.
Yeah. Let's come back to this wokeism business, but just stay with nihilism for a minute. This is a term that I'm not sure whether all of our audience is familiar with. How would you define it and the practice of it today in the schools is I guess the easiest way perhaps to showcase not only what it's about but what it will result in. But
Well,
give
there are
us a
two meaning.
definition.
Yeah, there are two meanings of nihilism. One is the destruction of values, of all values, for the sake of destruction, and then there's the other understanding of nihilism, which is sort of the belief in no overarching purpose or meaning in the cosmos, in life. And some people have taken that to mean there's no meaning outside of my personal subjective meaning. I place myself as being at the center of the universe. So my subjective whims, my caprices, my moods, my feelings are at the center of the universe. There's nothing over and beyond my emotions, my feelings. That's a form of nihilism because it supersedes any kind of transcendental uh, 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 meaning that can withstand
Not
the
least the idea of God in the world,
exactly
right? And
exactly.
it's a kind of narcissism, I guess, at the most macro level, micro level, but at the macro level, it is deadly for society, especially one like ours. And it's been, a phenomenon for many years in certain circles. It's just, I guess, what you're saying, Jason, is it is now gaining a currency as part of this larger woke religious um, culture, if you will, that is toxic in the extreme. And I would just say, I hope you're right in saying that this is a problem in government schools, but not in private schools or in parochial schools. Most
Well, it's
reporting that I've been getting is that it's pretty much across the board now.
it's
No.
across the board. No, yeah, it has become across the board. These idiopathogens are infectious, and you find in a lot of the parochial schools you find this problem. There are few parochial schools that don't exist. So, in terms of solutions, I am a big advocate of homeschooling or charter schools or seeking out those schools that actively resist these idiopathogens. Yeah.
Dr. Jason Hill, you talked about this woke religion as something that is very clearly set at the destruction of sort of the Judeo Christian traditions, the values, the norms, the institutions of our
Hmm.
country. Um, One of the vehicles for encouraging all of this, and I mean all of this, it seems, is this popular, I mean, wildly popular app called TikTok, a product of the Chinese Communist Party.
Hmm.
What we've been learning of late, as I'm sure you know, is not only that it has been honed to be extremely addictive, but also that it is being used not only as a means of collecting immense amounts of information from its users, some related directly to them and their personal data and medical history and all kinds of other things, genealogy, but also the people that they interact with or people that they come into contact with their phones and their microphones, I should say, and their cameras being perhaps remotely
Hmm.
turned on by the CCP. Beyond that, there's also this use of the platform by the Chinese Communist Party, both subliminally and more overtly, to communicate what is propaganda. Propaganda that's horrifically hostile to our country and that is very supportive of the Chinese Communist Party. So when you say, as you did early in the interview, we've got kids that are telling you in your, informal surveys, they want to bring about socialism in this country. It's hardly any wonder that they've gotten this intravenously fed to them by
Hmm.
TikTok, among other vehicles. Talk us through all of that, if you would.
Well, it's absolutely true. I mean, and they're addictive. They're highly persuasive. But I'm going to say something that is might be offensive to people, and that is parents really have outsourced their children not just to institutional education from K through 12, but they have reneged their responsibility to sort of monitor these devices and the extent to which their children um, are affixed to these devices. And I'm 57, so I can't compare the generation today. But I know that when I was growing up in Jamaica, TV signed on at 4 and it signed off at 11. And even then, it was regulated by my parents. But parents have to stop outsourcing their children. They're in competition with these devices in socializing their children, but they have got to sort of wake up and realize the demonic and the satanic, and I use that word quite deliberately, evil and satanic influences that TikTok and a lot of other social media outlets are having on their children's moral sensibilities, and stop outsourcing them to these institutions and realizing that they have got to stop being their children's friends and buddies and start becoming their parents and confiscating these devices at the risk of incurring the wrath of their children. It's okay. 10 years from now, your child is going to thank you.
This
Um,
is so important. I'm sure she's a friend of yours, as she is of mine. Sam Sorbo, a marvelous actress, but also a very um, engaged homeschooling champion who I think has written a book called "They're Your Children," and
mm,
she talks about how the first thing that we are signaling to our kids by turning them over to others to educate them, whether it's in the government schools, as you and she calls them, or private, parochial, or otherwise, is that we're not equipped to be their parents, that we're somehow deficient in that respect. And that, as you say, we're encouraging them to believe that we're at best their peers, their
mhm,
friends, and not people who have actual authority over them and know what's better for them. And one of the things that I'm really taken with in this regard, Jason, is the extent to which plays into what we started with. The idea that we're dealing with domestic as well as foreign adversaries who
mhm,
seek the destruction of this country, and many of whom have, as do the cultural Marxists, as you know so well, as a central focus of effort in that destructive program, that satanic program. You put your finger right on it.
Yes.
is destroying the family. And so
Yes.
when those parents are seemingly alienated from or less effective and are further reduced in stature by these programs that have in mind inculcating in their kids an enmity towards their parents, even to the point of reporting on them if they
Mhm.
engage in behavior that's unacceptable. This is so important. We're almost out of time. 45 seconds to you about the importance of the family in this exceptional nation.
The family is the bedrock. The nuclear family is the bedrock of America, and I think that parents have got to start the sacralization and the legitimacy of the family has been downplayed. It doesn't have the high prestige value that it has anymore, and that's largely because parents themselves, in chasing the American dream, and I'm a big advocate of the American dream, the children have got left behind. You've got children who are going for their TV dinners in their own rooms with their gadgets, and parents sitting in front of the living room TV having their dinners, and you're not having families sitting down at the dinner table having conversations. People have got to reclaim the family and imbue it with the sacredness and the holiness and the
A topic
sanctity that
to
it
which
once
we
had.
will return with you. Dr. Jason Hill, thank you for your time today. What an extraordinary visit. We look forward to the next one. Thanks to all of you for watching. Go forth and multiply.